This week on ICN, the stories you should have heard but didn't. Supreme Court rules corporations are people too. Pentagon report calls for new Office of Strategic Deception. FBI illegally collects over 2,000 phone records. World Health Organization calls for global consumer tax. Those stories and more next on Informed Citizen News. Hello and welcome to ICN, Informed Citizen News, January 31st, 2010. The Supreme Court recently ruled that limiting corporate funding of independent political broadcasts in candidate elections would conflict with the First Amendment and the freedom of speech. Most of the left-right debate over this ruling centers around the ability for government to limit corporate speech in elections. More fundamentally, the issue relates to corporate personhood. In other words, is a corporation a person? Are corporations protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution? For the last 124 years, the court has said yes, corporations and persons are the same as it relates to constitutional protections. Of course, the term corporation never appears in the text of the Constitution. It was an 1886 case that the Supreme Court made this pivotal leap. This case was an example of judges overstepping their mandate, which results in making the people politically lazy. If the people wanted corporations to be treated like persons, then they should have gone through the amendment process to update the Constitution. Instead, 5 judges in black robes made that decision. We might not have the corporate control of government we see today if today's laws only allow people to contribute in the election process. If the CEO of a company wants to push an agenda politically, they should contribute or vote as an individual. Corporations don't vote, people do. To give state-chartered corporations constitutional protection for political campaign financing, but restrict so-called free speech through the SEC and other government regulations is inconsistent at best. InsideDefense.com unearthed a chilling recommendation found this month within a Pentagon report. The report, produced by the Defense Science Board, advocated for the creation of a new joint military and intelligence agency for strategic deception. The report stated, "Deception cannot succeed in wartime without developing theory and doctrine in peacetime. To be effective, a permanent standing office with strong professional intelligence and operational expertise needs to be established." Of course, by its very mission, we'll never know if this agency of deception already exists. American Samoa is learning the harsh reality of central planning and the heavy hand of Congress. Samoa's leading industry was shipping canned tuna fish to the American mainland. Until a couple of years ago, the 2 leading canners, Starkist and Chicken of the Sea, had fisheries and canning plants located in the U.S. island territory. These companies were attracted to Samoa because of the abundance of tuna colonies and inexpensive labor. Although Samoa's average wages were lower than the mainland's, the tuna industry provided a relatively good standard of living for the island people, and the port activity made import of goods inexpensive as well. All that changed in 2007 when Congress adopted a mandatory increase in the national minimum wage by 2009, which also applied to U.S. territories. American Samoa is subject to congressional acts, but does not have direct representation or a vote. In the time since, the wage increase passed, Chicken of the Sea closed its plants, and Starkist reduced its workforce. Among the unintended consequences of congressional benevolence are rapidly rising consumer prices due to the higher shipping costs now necessary to bring consumer goods to the islands. A double whammy thanks to Congress. The FBI illegally collected more than 2,000 U.S. phone records between 2002 and 2006, according to internal bureau memos and interviews. Agents obtained records by invoking terrorism emergencies that did not exist, or simply by persuading phone companies. FBI officials issued approvals after the fact to justify their actions. Emails obtained by the Washington Post detail how counterterrorism officials inside FBI headquarters did not follow their own procedures that were put in place to protect civil liberties. Among those whose phone records were searched improperly were journalists from the Washington Post and the New York Times, according to interviews with government officials. The FBI seized phone records for those they determined to be related to terrorism investigations, with no independent third-party oversight. The FBI said it will use the Inspector General's findings to determine whether discipline is warranted for any agents involved in illegally obtaining phone records. The United Nations World Health Organization called for governments around the world to impose a global consumer tax on things like internet activity and paying bills online. The idea is the most lucrative and probably the most controversial of a number of schemes proposed by a 25-member panel of medical experts, academics, and healthcare bureaucrats. They have been working for the past 14 months at the WHO's behest on new and innovative sources of funding to accomplish major shifts in the production of medical research and development. Modeled after Unit Aid, a global commerce tax which aims to battle against HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Unit Aid, which began in 2006, is also hosted by the WHO, is financed in part by a tax of anywhere from $1.20 to $58 on airline tickets, among a group of nations led by France, Brazil, Chile, Norway, and Britain. According to WHO experts, it has raised around $1 billion since its inception, with 13 countries having already passed the airline tax legislation and several others in the process of doing so. The expert working group has also suggested asking rich, developed countries and cash-rich developing nations to set aside a certain percentage of their gross domestic product to finance worldwide research and development. On Christmas Eve of 2009, the U.S. Treasury decided to lift the caps on how much bailout money failed mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would receive to stay in business. The caps represented a maximum taxpayer exposure of $400 billion for both companies. Now, taxpayers will be on the hook for an unlimited amount for at least the next 3 years. As you can see here, the chart of future home mortgage resets over the next 3 years puts the taxpayer liability up to $8 trillion. All the act of one presidentially appointed bureaucrat. North and South Korea exchanged artillery fire near their disputed sea border on Wednesday, the second time in 3 months the rivals have clashed, briefly sending prices down in jittery Seoul financial markets. Analysts doubted the latest clash would escalate and saw it more as an attempt by North Korea to stress the instability on the Korean peninsula and press home its demand for a peace deal that would open the way to international aid for its ruined economy. North and South Korea are still technically at war, but all-out hostilities stopped under the 1953 ceasefire agreement that ended the 3-year conflict. We shared a story 2 weeks ago where a New York couple was arrested for homeschooling their children without getting their curriculum approved by the government. This week, a U.S. immigration judge granted asylum to a German family who fled to the United States in 2006 because they were under threat of persecution by the German government. It is illegal to homeschool your own children in Germany. The family had been arrested, fined, and at one point saw their children forcibly taken to public school by police. Living now in Tennessee, the family has the ability to teach their children, but still must file written notices and reports to the local public school superintendent, or otherwise be subject to the same treatment they received in Germany. Thanks for joining us this week. Help spread the word about ICN by sending a link to this broadcast to your friends and family. From all of us at Informed Citizen News, have a great week.